So recently I was having a conversation with a church member over coffee about our shared love of the Lord of the Rings. Themes from this famous J.R. Tolkien fantasy. I won't mention your name, David, so. I should warn you all, though, that oftentimes the best ideas for my sermons come from conversations with many of you. I confess, I steal ideas shamelessly. All good preachers do. So this anonymous church member was a fellow nerd when it comes to Tolkien, both the books and the movies. And the themes evoked from that story, themes of conflict with overwhelming odds, themes of hopelessness, themes of the power of people bonded in community and fellowship, themes of the dramatic possibility of a reversal where light wins over darkness. Who doesn't love those ideas? Many of you may not know is that Tolkien had been a soldier in World War I, where he experienced trench warfare in the Battle of the Somme, where he lost close friends in combat. And he often cited his experience in that war as a primary reason, a primary source for his own writing of the Lord of the Rings as he wrestled with the scars, the pain of war. Tolkien once gave a very famous lecture on the power of fantasy. He saw it not as an escape from reality, but a way to make sense of it. As he believed, imagination, storytelling gives our lives meaning. So in our admittedly geeky conversation, this church member shared how at the end, the story of Frodo's departure, of traveling, as it is called, into the West, how that image as a metaphor for death and the ending of one age into another. And he spoke of his own experience of grief, of loss of loved ones, both personal and in many ways in the larger context we find ourselves in the world today. We do seem to have lost something, don't we? Something about ourselves, maybe illusions about ourselves, the expectation, losing a sense of expectation of how we should treat each other and those vulnerable among us. And that grief, that loss, evokes for many of us grief and anger, fear and uncertainty, even at times, I must confess, denial. A desire to run away from the world. And I don't know about you, but it feels like the end of something. And we're unclear about what is coming, right? Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, tries to describe his vision of God's coming, God's presence. One might describe it, to be honest, as sheer fantasy, particularly in face of the world we live in. An act of imagination so beyond our own expectations, our own vision, we find it difficult to actually believe in it. Jesus, in this sermon, is doing something unexpected. He's turning everything upside down. God's kingdom, God's reality, God's presence is not how we might imagine the world works or will ever work. It seems impossible. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, seems a ridiculous statement. You are blessed by God when you find yourself at the end of your rope. When you find yourself so lost, so alone, so powerless in the face of everything, Jesus claims that's when God shows up. That's when you experience God's kingdom. At the lowest point in your life is when God becomes most real. Blessed are those, Jesus says, who mourn, for they will be comforted. That seems upside down. You are blessed when you experience grief, when you feel in your bones the sorrow of the world, whether that grief might be our own personal grief and pain, or might be in the face of the obvious brokenness of the world. For it is in grieving and expressing that grief, in admitting that pain, we find God present in ways that bring solace and comfort. Blessed are the meek, he says, for they will inherit the earth, which seems obviously upside down because we know the powerful are in control. The powerless, the vulnerable, the undocumented, the least of these actually become God's blessing in the world. He believes the world doesn't belong to the powerful and the all-powerful, but to the humble, to the unprivileged. The future belongs to those, Jesus says, who do not seek power, but seek compassion. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, it says, for they will be filled. It is, Jesus says, a good thing to yearn and desire goodness in the world, to yearn and hunger and thirst for justice for all of God's children, even if that is painful. It is in that deep down desire that we find change occurs, becomes real in our hearts, and possibly in the world. The truth is, if enough of us hunger and thirst for decency and goodness and truth, it would fill our world. And on it goes, Jesus says, blessed are the merciful, for they will feel mercy. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Where God meets us and blesses us is in the most unlikely of places and spaces. Grace shows up, appears among us when we are poverty of spirit, when we're at the end of our rope, when we find ourselves grieving in the world, when we find ourselves even feeling powerless before it. That's where grace shows up. Even those times when we feel that hope is dismissed and rejected, maybe made fun of online, maybe pepper sprayed and arrested and denounced. Grace shows up then. And the truth is, you actually know you're doing good when you do something that evokes such responses. Tolkien coined a phrase, I know I've used this before, but he coined a phrase, this dynamic that happens in fantasy and fairy tales. He called it a eucatastrophe, which was a moment, something that happens in a story. It doesn't simply make the story a happy ending, but rather an abrupt, almost miraculous turnaround in a situation that feels hopeless. Token, a committed Christian, calls the resurrection just such a eucatastrophe, where death seems to have won, where the powers that be seem to be pushing down any kind of hope for peace and possibility and justice and equality and compassion and care and truth, yet somehow the belief about God that Jesus had and that we are called to have is God's grace will show up. So when we find ourselves in our own lives despairing, not able to come up with ways in which to respond, when we find ourselves at the end of our rope, powerless and in pain, when we find ourselves in those moments of deep grief that all of us experience, when we find ourselves yearning for a better world that seems impossible, when we find ourselves hungering for goodness, eucatastrophe, God shows up. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.